In the 1960s, a cultural shift around mental health treatment began sweeping across the United States. Deinstitutionalization began and public outrage over psychiatric practices surged. The anti-psychiatry movement was gaining momentum. People were asking questions. What qualified as a diagnosis? How are these labels applied? And do we trust them, considering the significant real-world consequences that came with them? The movement challenged the very legitimacy of psychiatric theory and practice in itself. People began seeing serious problems in the way that these diagnoses were written and applied. They were vague, subjective, and inconsistent. And yet these same labels carried immense weight, stigma, loss of freedom, and sometimes irreversible harm. A pivotal moment in this critique came with the 1973 Rosenhan experiment entitled On Being Sane in Insane Places. In this study, perfectly healthy participants presented to a psychiatric hospital and they reported hearing voices in a very vague way. Despite showing no further symptoms, they were immediately admitted and labeled, usually with schizophrenia or manic depression, although not all of the participants were given the same diagnosis, despite presenting with identical symptoms. Once they were inside, they resumed their normal behavior. Despite this, they were already given their diagnostic labels, and because of this, everything they did was interpreted through the lens of illness, and ordinary actions were pathologized. The experiment exposed just how easily someone could be institutionalized and then how difficult it was to get out, to prove your sanity, and shed that psychiatric label. This wave of critique, combined with pressures from the federal government, led the American Psychiatric Association, also known as the APA, to do a complete overhaul of its diagnostic and statistical manual. In 1980, the DSM-3 was released. It marked a shift towards greater scientific legitimacy, a move towards operationalized criteria and more standardized diagnoses. This was the beginning of a new era, one in which diagnoses would no longer be rooted in abstract theory, but instead grounded in research and empirical data. The APA promised clearer definitions, more structured criteria, and demonstrated reliability and validity. In this process, several diagnoses were removed or revised. Among them were the hysterical diagnoses, hysterical neurosis, and hysterical personality. The term hysteria was dropped because of its long and controversial history. It's rooted in the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. Hysteria has always been a deeply and inherently gendered diagnosis. From ancient Egypt to Victorian England to the 20th century, hysteria acted as a catch-all label for essentially any and all womanly ills. But even more broadly, it served as a way to pathologize women, their emotionality, their sexuality, or their nonconformity to their gender roles. Doing away with this disorder marked a major turning point. It was an end to vague and biased labels. It was an end to pathologizing female behavior. Wasn't it? Well, the hysterical diagnoses were removed, but like the mythical Hydra, cutting off one head only led to the growth of 3 more. In its place rose somatoform disorder and dissociative disorder, and the focus of this video, histrionic personality disorder. Histrionic personality disorder, often shorthanded to HPD, replaced hysterical personality disorder in the DSM-3. Given the goals of the DSM-3, surely one could assume that this new diagnosis was unlike its predecessor, that this one was scientific, objective, free of gender bias, and firmly grounded in research. Surely it had been standardized, rigorously defined, and demonstrated high inter-rater reliability. Right? Well, not exactly. I argue that ontologically, histrionic personality disorder is not a personality disorder, but instead a cultural disorder, a result of attitudes towards traditionally feminine styles of interaction. HPD is not a real mental pathology. Rather, histrionic refers to a trait or a cluster of personality traits that might lead to some other mental disorder. The so-called histrionic disorder is neither a pathological disorder nor a moral disorder, as arguably are the other cluster Bs. Despite being included in the DSM for over 45 years, histrionic personality disorder remains one of the least studied diagnoses. I searched high and low for research on HPD and found shockingly little. The limited literature that does exist consistently shows that its prevalence is low, its comorbidity with other disorders is very high, and its internal consistency is weak. Findings on reliability are mixed, but they generally trend towards the lower end of the spectrum. From everything I can tell, the DSM-3 field trials didn't even report disorder-specific reliability data for the personality disorders, so there was not specific data for HPD because there was only data for access to personality disorders as a whole, and even those findings at best showed moderate reliability. This is all very confusing to me. I can't help but wonder, how is this diagnosis ever included in the DSM-3? With so little empirical support, or even seemingly any serious attempts to substantiate it. In my opinion, the historical lasting legacy of hysteria has carried this diagnosis into the DSM-3 and beyond, more so than the research, seeing as the research really isn't there, and the research that is not strong. It turns out that the historical biases and dominant theoretical ideas aren't so easy to shake off. Just saying, we're going to base our diagnoses now on research, we promise, isn't enough. Before diving deeper into the issues with the HPD diagnosis, let's first take a look at what HPD is exactly, per the DSM-5 TR. Histrionic personality disorder, a pervasive pattern of excessive emotionality and attention-seeking, beginning by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of the following. 1. Is uncomfortable in situations in which he or she is not the center of attention. 2. Interaction with others is often characterized by inappropriate, sexually seductive, or provocative behavior. 3. Displays rapidly shifting and shallow expressions of emotions. 4. Consistently uses physical appearance to draw attention to self. 5. Has a style of speech that is excessively impressionistic and lacking in detail. 6. Shows self-dramatization, theatricality, and exaggerated expressions of emotion. 7. Is suggestible, i.e., easily influenced by others or circumstances. 8. Considers relationships to be more intimate than they actually are. One issue that immediately stands out to me when I read this is the use of loaded, highly subjective language throughout the criteria. What is considered inappropriate, excessive, shallow, etc.? It leaves significant room, I would argue far too much room, for interpretation based on a provider's personal views and biases. This likely contributes to the inconsistency and unreliability of diagnosing of this disorder. While the gender bias is, in my opinion, quite obvious, with the criteria describing traditionally feminine characteristics and stereotypes, intense emotionality, being dramatic, fixation on looks, sexualization, etc., I'm actually not centering my main argument as to why I think it should be removed from the DSM around this. I mention it here and I will touch on it again later because it is true and it's important to consider, but there is a much more direct critique for this diagnosis not being legitimate. There really just isn't tangible empirical evidence supporting it, pretty much at all, which makes it odd that it was added to the DSM in the first place. The criteria for HPD may be measuring something real, but the evidence does not support it measuring any one specific discrete thing, nor does it support whatever it does measure being disordered. Let me explain. A 2010 study examining the validity of histrionic personality disorder as a construct highlighted several key issues, most of which had also been observed in previous research. They looked at over 2,000 patients at a Norwegian psychotherapeutic day hospital over the course of 10 years. Their findings gave several reasons as to why HPD should be removed from the DSM. Extremely low prevalence. Over the course of the 10 years of the study, only 10 out of 2,289 patients met the criteria for an HPD diagnosis. This strikingly low prevalence has been seen in all existing literature on the topic. Weak internal consistency of its criteria. The study found that the 8 individual criteria of HPD do not strongly correlate with one another, and it failed to statistically meet the threshold of what is considered an adequate internal consistency. However, they did find that the criteria did barely meet the threshold when one outlier was removed, criteria 7, which is suggestible, i.e. influenced by others or circumstances. This criteria not only had very low correlations to the other criteria of HPD, it had a higher correlation with other disorders, actually, specifically dependent personality disorder and avoidant personality disorder. This lack of cohesion of the HPD criteria is an issue, as ideally a diagnosis should reflect a cohesive pattern of traits that all tap into the same underlying root, whatever the core of that disorder is. HPD does not seem to be a coherent disorder. Extremely high comorbidity and overlap. Of the 10 patients diagnosed with HPD in the study, only 2 had HPD as their sole diagnosis. The rest showed significant comorbidity, particularly with borderline narcissistic and dependent personality disorders. This is consistent with other research, which has consistently shown that HPD is almost never a sole diagnosis. There's also considerable diagnostic overlap. Individuals diagnosed with HPD met, on average, about 5.3 out of 8 of the HPD criteria, just enough to meet the diagnostic threshold of 5. But in addition to this, they met a total of 22.6 personality disorder criteria across all personality disorders. This means that approximately 17 of the traits that they met came from other disorders, not HPD. This raises serious questions about the distinctiveness and validity of HPD. Histrionic traits may not be a problem in themselves. I think the most damning evidence from the study is what happened when researchers controlled for those other personality disorder traits that patients met. Initially, they found a small but statistically significant correlation between the number of HPD traits and higher ratings of psychological distress and interpersonal problems, as well as lower functioning overall. However, once they accounted for participants' other personality disorder traits, these correlations disappeared. In other words, HPD traits alone do not significantly predict lower functioning, distress, or interpersonal difficulties. These findings suggest that most of the traits seen in individuals diagnosed with HPD come from other personality disorders, and that their psychological difficulties are more likely tied to those traits, not the histrionic traits. This calls into question whether the HPD criteria on their own represent a distinct or clinically meaningful disorder at all. Are the HPD criteria actually disordered in any way? Are we just pathologizing a vague set of behaviors that might correlate with other disorders but aren't necessarily dysfunctional in and of themselves? Carol Steinberg-Gould's article, Why the Histrionic Personality Disorder Must Not Be in the DSM, does an incredible job explaining many of the issues with HPD as a diagnosis from a philosophical perspective. As I quoted at the beginning of this section, she conceptualizes HPD as a cultural disorder as opposed to a legitimate clinical diagnosis. Quote, HPD is qualitatively different from other cluster B disorders. It doesn't involve the same kinds of boundary violations or disregard for others. The histrionic exhibits no behavioral characteristic that we could deem morally bad. The histrionic is reacting to a disordered culture. There is nothing pathological about having a dramatic elan or an aesthetic concern with self-preservation. Having histrionic traits could give rise to shame, anxiety, body dysmorphic disorder, or a number of other problems, depending on one's surrounding environment and people. The goal for the histrionic should be not to change her fundamental traits, but rather to attain insights into the ambivalent culture that has tainted her with a diagnostic label. A personality style is not a personality disorder, even in a culture where the style may be treated as a disorder. I don't find it easy to think of any legitimate arguments as to why or how histrionic personality disorder makes sense as a DSM diagnosis. After all this research, I'm honestly left baffled by all of this. HPD was considered for removal during the DSM-5 revision process. However, it was lumped in with a broader initiative to overhaul the entire personality disorder section through a proposed alternative dimensional model for diagnosing personality disorders. Something that I think, while not perfect, makes much more sense than the current model, though I won't go off on that tangent right now. However, this proposed change sparked significant backlash, and the APA board ultimately decided against changing the personality disorders. Critics argued that personality disorders should not be changed for the sake of consistency, a lack of widespread acceptance, and questions about empirical evidence. In an article discussing the controversy, the article states that the major changes to the DSM criteria require broad consensus of expert clinical opinion and substantial empirical support as demonstrated by diagnostic stability, response to treatment, and predictive validity. I find it ironic that this level of evidence appears to be required only when considering the removal of a diagnosis, even though such rigorous support was never established for its inclusion in the first place. Some say that the historical legacy is too significant to be ignored. Certainly there must be something to histrionic traits. Why else would these traits have been seen as a problem across so many eras and cultures throughout all of time, if there wasn't some underlying truth to them being problematic? I personally don't give as much weight to that argument, though, as I believe the historical view of women as inferior and the consistent disdain for and subjugation and control of women has existed since the beginning of human history, and that this is simply one manifestation of that. The one argument I do find compelling comes from real people who have been diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder. It's certainly a complicated issue. There are some individuals who have gotten this diagnosis who find it stigmatizing, but there are also others who have found it to be very valuable and meaningful in their lives and are fervent supporters of keeping it in the DSM. For these individuals, having a name for their experience has brought them clarity, self-understanding, and a sense of empowerment. They strongly oppose the removal of HPD from the DSM, and their voices highlight the importance of considering the lived experience alongside the clinical critique. One of the only places where I was able to find people openly discussing their experiences with histrionic personality disorder was a forum, specifically the subreddit r/HPD. While it's a small and self-selecting community, of course, it nonetheless offers valuable insight into how some individuals with this diagnosis understand and relate to it. A number of users there express that the diagnosis has helped them make sense of their patterns and behaviors, and as I discussed earlier, that they feel strongly that it should not be removed from the DSM. One example of this is one of the top posts of all time on the forum, entitled, "Anyone Else Scared of HPD Possibly Being Removed from the Next DSM?" with a photo still from this scene from the 2022 film Pearl.
No, I'm a star! Please, I'm a star!
The poster says, "Word on the psychology streets is that the DSM committee may or may not remove HPD as a diagnosis and disorder in the next DSM edition due to lack of empirical research done on individuals with HPD and overall stigma associated with the history of the disorder. Apparently, if HPD is removed, it will basically be merged or reclassified in a way with narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. Does this make anyone else feel an impending sense of dread and doom? I genuinely feel like it would be a huge mistake for them to remove HPD. The disorder isn't well known or well researched enough simply because many individuals who have HPD are undiagnosed or just unaware of the disorder, or may even feel that they don't have a disorder. But communities like this sub are basically a testament that prove people with HPD need specialized therapeutic consideration. We're small but mighty in a way. Even my own personal experiences of how HPD manifests for me has been a blessing and a curse. I'm vivacious, attractive, unique, and eccentric, but easily liked. But at the same time, I'm easily influenced, detrimentally emotional and moody. My need for attention and drama in my life has landed me in some pretty bad situations. I'm a pathological liar. I lie so much to paint this specific image of myself in people's heads. Sometimes I even begin to believe the lies I tell. Anything for the attention that I feel I would shrivel up and pass away without. I just feel like those with HPD would not fit very well if grouped into NPD or BPD in the next DSM edition, unless someone is already comorbid with either. I feel too empathetic and not so haughty for NPD, yet not moody and dependent enough for BPD. What HPD has going on is uniquely fitting for me. Not only that, but in a way, self-aware HPD-coded way, I wouldn't feel as unique or special anymore if I get grouped in with BPDers or the narcissists." A comment on the post reads, "I was reading several articles about it last year, and I've been thinking about it, and it's killing me. People won't understand, but for eternity, I've never felt like I belong anywhere. Having this label makes me feel at ease. At least there's a box I can fit in. I'm also comorbid with bipolar, but I feel like HPD is what defines me. You can feel dramatic all your life, but the moment you know that there's a scientific label behind your shenanigans and freakiness, you realize that it's not just in your head, it's real. There are these real people who are diagnosed with HPD who feel perhaps for the first time in their lives seen, understood, and validated by the diagnosis. Getting this diagnosis has changed their lives. It's allowed them to find and connect with others online for support, share their experiences, and seek out specialized care tailored to their struggles. Now, I'm certainly not saying that disorder should remain in the DSM simply because some people want it. But at the same time, I do believe that it's always important to listen to the voices of people who are currently living with the diagnosis. It's important to understand why they feel strongly that it shouldn't be discarded. The question then becomes, how can we best serve these individuals? How do we develop a deeper understanding of their core struggles? And how can clinicians offer meaningful, effective care that address their unique needs? I tried to see if I could talk directly to someone diagnosed with HPD over Zoom, and I briefly messaged with some people on the forum, but unfortunately scheduling didn't work out. Nonetheless, I gained a great deal of insight from reading the experiences shared on the forum. I will read some more excerpts and discuss themes that came up, ones that align with the current diagnostic criteria and ones that are not explicitly included. I'll start by noting that all of the criteria for HPD feel almost entirely surface level to me. It's gesturing towards some real experience, some struggle, but it falls short of truly capturing or understanding its root, its depth, or complexity. When reading people's experiences, the major trait that stood out, which appears to be the core struggle that connects everyone with HPD, is an extreme, profound difficulty not being the center of attention. This aligns directly with criteria 1, is uncomfortable in situations in which he or she is not the center of attention. However, it's important to note that this particular trait is not required for diagnosis. It's just one of the 8 criteria, and meeting any 5 is sufficient. Additionally, I don't think the way this criteria is written comes anywhere close to capturing the intensity of this issue. It's not some shallow, me, I need everyone looking at me because I think I'm so special and important kind of dynamic. And it's certainly not just a vague, uncomfortable feeling when not receiving attention. The experience described by those with HPD is a much, much deeper thing. The HPD attention-seeking appears to stem from an unmet emotional need, a persistent longing for validation and or a sense of self-worth, or often even more generally, a sense of self, period. One of the top posts from the forum discusses this experience. The post is entitled, "How I Currently Understand HPD." We're not attention-seeking, we're approval-seeking. That's it. We are just too insecure to cope internally with any aspect of our selfhood. That's why we constantly externalize to others, even stuff we seem confident in. Not just grandiosity like narcissists, vulnerability like borderlines, and superficiality and charm like sociopaths, but everything else too. Our identities, memories, opinions, thoughts, emotions, questions. We don't know how to access this stuff without externalizing it, no matter how sure we try to seem, or how much we might want some privacy. We can't even think to ourselves without imagining we're performing to someone else. Overshare does not even begin to describe how we operate. It's like we are compulsively turning ourselves inside out for other people. Whether we're hyper extroverts who are afraid to stop socializing for a second, neurotic introverts who cling to our favorite people and avoid spaces when there's no one to listen to us, or an irregular combination, none of us know how to live inside of ourselves. We are strictly seeking the approval of others. It runs no deeper than wanting to be liked, even at the expense of our dignity, boundaries, relationships, values, and connections to ourselves. We live like adult children. Our brains treat everyone we meet as potential sources of parental approval we can't generate internally. So we are trapped in a state of blind idealization, love, and trust towards others, just as a child blindly idealizes, loves, and trusts their caretakers. That's why we dive head on into intimacy, why we don't usually devalue others or lack empathy despite our narcissistic traits, and why we're so easily taken advantage of. We have no walls. We think everybody else knows better than us, and that nothing truly belongs to us. If we revisit the criteria with this in mind, it becomes clear that many of the traits may be better understood as surface-level expressions of a deeper emotional need, specifically this need for approval or validation. Attention becomes the vehicle through which individuals with HPD attempt to meet this underlying need. In this context, behaviors such as sexually provocative conduct, theatrical or exaggerated emotional expression, and quote-unquote using physical appearance are all just different kinds of manifestations of getting attention. Given this, I'm not convinced it makes sense to treat those behaviors as separate, disordered traits. The post also touches on another theme that is not included in the criteria, but seems to be a common thread that nearly everyone I found talking about their experiences expressed: this struggle feeling a sense of self. This is something that is included in the criteria for borderline, so that may go back to how there's this significant overlap and comorbidity between BPD and HPD. However, this lack of identity was also described by many as being deeply tied to that need for attention that is more specific to HPD. Many describe this as a both mental and physical struggle of feeling like they, quote, do not exist when they are not being given attention or when they are alone. Several posters describe this experience. Histrionic attention seeking feels like I need you to give me attention so I feel less empty, more human, less dissociated from myself. For me, it's the physical shutdown I feel when I've been left completely alone. Something about it powers my body down, almost like I need to hibernate to save energy because I can't take care of myself. I think it's because I have this sense that I only exist around other people, so when there's nobody around, I can't exist in any way other than physically. I feel like I'm not a human being unless I have an audience, and it's insane. It leads to a lot of depressive episodes or that horrible emptiness feeling. It's like if you're not getting attention, then you feel like you don't even exist, so you no longer matter, and therefore spurs intense feelings of needing to be relevant and having attention put back on you, so you'll feel alive again, basically. I feel super empty if no one is talking to me or giving me attention, so much so that I feel like a shell of a human, like I'm not even a person. It's the worst feeling in the world. I often engage in unhealthy behavior to prevent feeling like this. I dress and act in a certain way to try to get as many people to fall in love with me as possible. I want everyone to fall in love with me. I feel emotions very intensely, and I over-exaggerate them for attention and pity. When I have a pain in my foot, I limp so that everyone notices I'm hurt and asks if I'm okay. I actually think this is a completely overlooked part of the disorder that should be in the DSM. I've always been really, really worried about my appearance to others because it's the only way I can exist. And I know that's how it feels because of the way my body reacts when I'm left completely alone. I shut down, become numb to emotions, and physically slow, and I feel like I have no sense of identity. For many, the need for attention functions as a necessary way to affirm their very existence, to feel real, seen, and grounded. It's not just an insecurity or low self-esteem. It can reflect a deeper struggle with identity and embodiment. This can manifest as a fragile or unstable sense of self on a psychological level, and also in a somatic form, with individuals experiencing dissociation when they are not actively receiving attention from others. Attention becomes a lifeline, not for ego gratification, but for psychological cohesion. One community member posted an online seminar about her experience living with HPD on YouTube, which I found to be illuminating. Here she discusses what she wishes everyone knew about HPD.
HPD is more than just drama. Okay, so this is what I want to scream to the whole world. So, being theatrical and being dramatic, it's only a few features of us. It's not what defines us in general. I remember my therapist, she always focused on me being over emotional. That is my biggest problem, actually. But yeah, it's just me. And it is because of the deeper emotional vulnerabilities. Also, what makes us different than like NPD or BPD is that we have a deep desire for affection, of love, and that's why we often seek validation. And then, if left untreated, we can try to get attention in a very unhealthy way. In general, we are more than just drama. We actually, HPD itself, the core personality trait of HPD is that we experience intense emotions and then we need connection. And it's like super duper high. How high? We have a primal desire for affection, as primal as if you feel hungry, you gotta eat. What happens if you don't eat? You're gonna die, right? Yeah, something like that.
It's hard for me to imagine that the diagnosis, as it currently is the best way to get the clients the specialized, appropriate care they need. In fact, I'd confidently say it's not. However, is it possible that keeping the diagnosis but simply reevaluating it or improving on it is better than merging it with other disorders it already overlaps with, or doing away with the disorder altogether? It's possible. It doesn't feel correct to me looking at the data and the history, but it's not impossible. Ultimately, real people and practical reality is what's important to me at the end of the day. What will lead to the best outcomes? What will best help the clients who are struggling and best help the practitioners understand what they are struggling with? I take great issue with the diagnosis of histrionic personality disorder as it is written today. The current HPD diagnosis doesn't hold up conceptually or empirically. It overlaps extensively with other disorders. The criteria has poor cohesion and doesn't seem to truly measure one specific condition. I think the people with this diagnosis are nearly always experiencing some real profound mental challenges. But I feel that HPD does not truly capture what that is that they're struggling with. It doesn't identify what is at the heart of their distress. It merely gestures towards it, capturing vaguely some behaviors that may indirectly be indicative of distress, but in and of themselves are not disordered behaviors. It treats what may be complex coping behaviors as standalone dysfunctions. It is steeped in gendered assumptions that over-pathologize emotional expression and attention-seeking behaviors in a vague way. It focuses on surface-level behaviors while missing deeper psychological roots such as trauma, early socialization, attachment wounds, low self-esteem, a fractured sense of self, and social conditioning. In my opinion, it focuses on all the wrong things: appearance, sexual behavior, and emotional expressiveness, rather than internal distress. Caring about one's looks, being highly sexual, enjoying attention, or having a flair for the dramatic are not inherently pathological traits. The pathologization of these characteristics is not only outdated, but it's deeply puritanical, misogynistic, and reflective of a long history of controlling and medicalizing women's behavior. While, as I discussed earlier, the validity of HPD is so shaky it does not even require delving into the inherent gender bias of it in detail, it is simply true and blatantly apparent that the criteria are extremely gendered in nature. Labeling them as pathological fails to see how women are socialized. We're taught susceptibility as a norm. We're taught to be relational, to be polite, to be emotionally attuned, and to please others. We're encouraged to conform, to accommodate. We're taught that our sexuality is the form of power available to us as women in a world where we are systematically disempowered. Even if we're not using, quote-unquote, our sexuality, women are sexualized generally, and our behaviors are often interpreted through a sexualized lens. Our politeness is labeled as leading someone on. We're taught to focus on our physical appearance, to make ourselves desirable. We're told our value lies in how we look. We're taught that being attractive is the only way to be cared about. Even if we're caring to our appearance based on what we personally enjoy, our presentation is attributed to wanting attention and to wanting the approval of others. We are taught as women that we are not for ourselves, never for ourselves, but rather objects to be viewed and consumed by the world around us. The way HPD is conceptualized currently does not account for this, but rather perpetuates it. It is necessary that this diagnosis is either removed from the DSM or entirely reevaluated and rebuilt from the ground up, based on real and thorough research. In doing so, however, we must also consider how to support those who resonate with the disorder, the people who have the diagnosis currently. Their experiences are valid, and any revision or removal must ensure that they aren't left without a framework for understanding themselves. Ideally one that offers further understanding, greater depth, and nuance.